Welcome. My name is Jane Lemke. I'm the curator at the Burnaby Village Museum.
And my name is Anushay. I teach history at SFU and was the co-curator with Jane on this exhibit.
So welcome. We're going to take you through this exhibit, Truths Not Often Told, being South Asian in Burnaby, which opened at the Burnaby Village Museum in May of 2023 and will be open until the beginning of 2025. So as a curator, my job here at the museum is to try and bring diversity to this site. We're a 10-acre heritage village site, which has a lot of opportunity to explore different stories about what it means to be a community. So this exhibit is really our attempt to bring South Asian Canadian stories into the village.
As a South Asian historian, this is a subject I've been working on for many years now. And when I first moved from Lahore, which is my hometown, to BC, it was then that I started getting more involved in researching on South Asians within BC, so South Asian Canadians and their history. And it was in that vein that I really wanted to be involved in the project that the museum had already been doing for about a year. And Jane asked me to join in then as the co-curator, which was a fantastic opportunity for me, but something very new as well, because I'd never done visual storytelling. I'd never done work in a museum. And I think that's the kind of relationship we ended up evolving as we figured out how we wanted this exhibit to go.
Yes, we became very good at realizing that Anushay's specialization in history was what she brought to the table, and I brought a very good sense of what the public was going to be able to absorb in an exhibit. So the public does not want to read everything. They are not academics, but we have to try and make sure that we prioritize the most important, higher level concepts so that if people leave our exhibit, they get the main point.
Yeah.
Which brings me to how we started to process some of this research. So we brought Anushay on board after about a year of having our researchers do 1 year in archives, so driving up primary sources, trying to find these South Asian Canadian stories in Burnaby's history. So looking back at the census, the school district records, and what they found was not as much as we hoped. So we discovered that there wasn't that much written historically about the South Asian Canadian community in Burnaby. They were very specific one-off stories and not representative of the community that actually was here 100, 120 years ago.
And so we decided then to implement a methodology called counter-storytelling, which we'll tell you more about in just a minute. But the idea there was to piece together information based on what the community itself tells us. And so you have to really understand what matters to the community and use that as an access point to then go into the archives and figure out what material is available and paint a larger story around it. So part of what we did was then access the community by having a community event, which was held in August last year. And that event involved asking people who were South Asian from across BC, but prioritizing groups of people who were connected to Burnaby's history to come and tell us what mattered to them.
From there, we decided to form an advisory committee. So we took the most interested community members that represented the most diverse experiences of South Asian Canadians in Burnaby and get them in a room and have them really guide the exhibit development process. So they were able to tell us what stories were most important, what expressions of identity they wanted to see, what really they wanted the general public to understand about being South Asian Canadian, so that it wasn't us representing an entire community or even just the museum representing an entire community, but really the community itself telling others about themselves. So now we'll walk into the exhibit.
Let's go.
We're going to take you through the different parts of the exhibit to explain how we came to the decisions we did. So what ended up being in the exhibit wasn't the full story. We had lots of other examples and stories that we chose not to put in for various reasons, and that we will explain. But essentially, we came to the bigger picture of realizing that a central theme was to challenge assumptions that the general public has about being South Asian Canadian.
And we discovered this over a long process of many conversations, over many lunches, where we realized that we all, myself included, Jane included, everyone we spoke to, has specific assumptions about what South Asian means, what migration means. And what's really interesting is that all of those stories are true, right? And which means that there isn't one narrative of what South Asian migration is. And that's really what we wanted to show, that our assumptions are based on what we see. And so what we saw when we looked through, for example, what you see here are excerpts from newspapers. And when we were going through newspapers that were published by Burnaby, one of the things that we saw is that the visual imagery either represented no diversity whatsoever, so almost entirely white stories, white faces, or diversity in an extremely exoticized way. And so what we wanted to show was that because this is what you see, this is what you assume Burnaby is about. The decision of how to take these specific pictures, however, was one that I, for one, at least struggled with, because I wasn't entirely sure which one of the images would convey the main point that we wanted to convey.
Yes, working with an academic was really interesting because Anushay sent me, 25 examples. And what we ended up doing was picking the one that illustrated the concept the best. So this one is a very exoticized, it even says exhibitionist right there in English for the general public to have absorbed from a newspaper. So if that's what you saw for being South Asian Canadian in Burnaby, that was what you thought the whole community existed of. And if that's all you saw of what Burnaby's history was, then you would not have an understanding that there was any diversity whatsoever.
Absolutely, and I think that's also why we discussed then that we wanted people to think about what the term South Asia means. In fact, for many people, South Asia is a term used to describe a set of countries, but depending on where you search for the term, you're going to get a different set of countries. So even in a geographical sense, it's very obvious that what is South Asia has different meanings depending on what algorithm is going to determine your search results. So should we move on to the next then?
So the next part of the exhibit, we chose to really highlight one of the stories that was hard to find in the newspapers. So if our central concept was to challenge assumptions that there was a community here, even if the newspapers didn't really show it properly, that we wanted to take the public through the process of how our researchers go through archives. So how they start with the higher level tiny bits of information you can find in newspapers and how you might find a whole story underneath it.
Absolutely, and I think what was so fascinating when I joined the project was these guys already, the museum researchers, had already found the name Bana Singh as an individual who owned property within Burnaby. And using the counter-storytelling methodology meant looking through multiple archives and academic sources to see where else we could find his name. And what we found is it appeared in coroner's reports, and it appeared in terms of explaining how he died. And that led us to look at reports that are generated by a murder. Now, to highlight the main point here, if he hadn't been murdered, these documents would never have been produced. Because people were interested in finding more about the murder, it was covered in the newspapers. You also saw in the documents something that's not as horrifying, which is he's part of a community. There were people around him who helped him, who he helped, and as people were interviewed from within his family, we found that the first stories you guys saw about how there's a white South Asia within the newspapers was entirely untrue. There were people within Burnaby who were family members, who were working in the same area, who knew one another, who were all from South Asia and supporting one another, but entirely invisible in the first glance in the archives. In this section, we wanted to talk about the multiple stories of migration. And one of the main ideas that was very obvious to us was when we started interviewing Burnaby's communities, we found that people had not just migrated from South Asia directly. They'd actually come not just as migrants, but in some cases as indentured laborers, which in the context of the early 20th century was a group of workers who had been moved to work from South Asia to Africa, mainly in places like Kenya and Uganda to work on British railways. And so when you're coming as South Asian from within Africa, you're coming as South Asian, as African, as part of the British Empire, and yet only one aspect of that story shows up in the term South Asian migrants. So what we really wanted to capture was this idea that there are multiple stories of migration, that they're connected to a bigger story than Burnaby, which is the story of the British Empire, but it's still a story of Burnaby, of local people trying to make their lives, trying to live and enjoy and spend time with their families. And so that's the story that you see over here, and the specifics of those stories that you see over here. So people who own grocery stores, who run radio channels, are all part of the story that we then encountered. One of the things we also wanted to show is that migrants are not the only category that we have assumptions about. Race is also a category that we have an assumption about. In the Bana Singh story we discussed, for example, in the coroner's report, Bana Singh's racial identity was listed as Hindu. Hindu is not a racial identity, it's actually a religious identity. And similarly, we wanted to convey the somewhat more complicated point that race in and of itself is not a biological reality. This part, again, was something that I had a lot of detail about, but Jane and I, in conversation then, figured out a way to make it more accessible, especially to younger people.
Yeah, this section, even though it's relatively small, took us probably longer than any other section in the exhibit because the history of the British Empire is very diverse and long and complicated, and people moving around the world there's different stories depending on when and who you were and what your experiences were. But we also wanted to make sure that it set the tone for why people came to Burnaby, how people came to Burnaby, and what their experiences were in terms of its diversity. So we took some of the really big definitions that are really complicated, and you do have multiple textbooks on such a concept, so that people got a tiny sliver of what some of these concepts were. So a colony, a settler colony, those are different, and we wanted people to explore how Canada is not the same as a colony, it's a settler colony. So there are different ways that people can interact with this history, and we wanted to encourage conversation. So for people that are visiting the exhibit, our hope is that you talk when you're here, exploring these different concepts. So depending on your experiences or what assumptions you come to the exhibit with, you might learn a lot from this one small section, or you might just expand what you already understand. Same with indentured workers. There's an academic, but also an accessible definition of it. Over here is our wonderfully illustrative map of migration over 120 plus years of South Asian migration to Burnaby and BC. So it takes you from 1897, when the first documented South Asian Canadians came through BC, all the way up to 2021, based on records from census and different records available through the Canadian archives.
There are certain turning points at which you see migration shoot up. 1908, you had the continuous journey provision, which many people here told us about, many South Asians told us about in the interviews as well. It's when you had to come via a route that stopped. So you couldn't come unless you were coming continuous journey, but for coming to India, you would have to have stopped before. So that made it near impossible for people to come unless they were coming through illegal means. It's only in the 1960s that you really had an increase in migration numbers because you had a system of points that was put in place to allow more people to come in. But it was only when the continuous journey provision was removed, and then after 1946, in 1947, when South Asians were allowed to vote, that you had an increase in their migration and an increase in their representation in the archives.
So another detail we wanted to explore is the concept of having to leave a home country. So we wanted to impart the concept that people left for all kinds of reasons and arrived in Burnaby for all kinds of reasons. And the packing up of belongings, or not having a chance to pack at all, or not having belongings to bring at all, was part of our exploration of the journey to Burnaby and how people arrived in Burnaby. So we took physical objects from community members after hearing their stories of what they arrived with. So their journeys were all different, where they stopped was different, and what they were able to bring was an interesting conversation in terms of economic opportunities and diversity of experiences. And then we actually did an interactive for children so that they can interact with the concept that you had to choose. You only had so much available opportunity to bring things, and would you choose pants or a toothbrush? Obviously, it's very hypothetical, but we wanted the concept to interact with that choice to come through.
And we did actually see that there was a difference in, over time, the things that they bought and the manner in which they arrived, whether by ship or by airplane, that completely changed the experience. So it really required thinking about what was most meaningful, both in terms of telling the history of South Asians as well as representing the community. And I think what we ended up with was the stories that were repeated the most often. So for example, we heard, one of the stories we heard again and again was of a rajai, or a quilt, that people would have a process by which they got them made before they came. And they were traditionally made by women, and they seem to be female artisans who made them before they arrived, and then they bought them and preserved those quilts or rajais. So we really wanted to include that. So I think maybe the challenge of how we found something that represented a rajai was also interesting to me as an academic to watch happen at a museum.
So this section of the exhibit talks about the specificity of people we spoke to in Burnaby. So the different stories and the journeys and the things people brought with them. So we have different objects of importance to the South Asian Canadian community that were loaned to us. And we're hoping to expand this section of the exhibit. We have included a QR code so that people can tell us a bit more about their journeys. So if they identify with some of this work, they can expand our knowledge by adding to it. They can tell us their story, they can donate things, they can loan us things. But you have these wonderful pictures of different family in Burnaby from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, or in particular, this one right here is from the 1940s at the sawmill at Barnett Marine Park.
And I think it was the meaningfulness of it is how we picked the images that you see in front of you as well, and also the poems that are generally playing in the background when the museum is open. The poems were written by poets and authors who we interviewed, who are Burnaby residents, and they recited their poems in multiple languages, usually in Urdu and Punjabi, and they recited them as things that are meaningful to them and connected to the story of Burnaby. So that's how they picked the poems that were going to be part of the exhibit as well. So in this section, as we were doing interviews and talking to people about discrimination they may have encountered, what we found was that their experiences of discrimination were both local to Burnaby and global as well. So for example, many of the people that we spoke to actually remembered being either student activists or they had family members who were connected to anti-colonialism. Anti-colonialism, by which we mean groups who were fighting against the British Empire quite literally. So for example, Kapoor Singh Sidhu, who then went on to make the Barnett Mills, which many of you would already know about and which is an important part of Burnaby's history, was himself connected to anti-colonial circles, particularly a party that was called the Ghaddar Party, and you see its pamphlet right here. It wrote in the two scripts that were used by people within Indian Punjab at that point in time. And as we kept interviewing people, these stories kept on building. And so one of the challenges we then had is how do we choose which stories do both things, represent the local and the global, and are simultaneously meaningful to people who live in Burnaby today?
We chose, 10 different stories that tried to express different forms of activism. So these stories all connect to the global lens that were in the news, in the global media, but also were felt locally by Burnaby's community of South Asian Canadians. So for example, we have a story here from the 1980s of resistance against what was called the Ku Klux Klan. And it's a pretty wonderful picture. And then you kind of explore a little bit about some of the bigger stories as well as the people in Burnaby that were fighting against these different kinds of oppression. And we hope these stories continue to build. One thing we know about exhibit development is that as soon as we open an exhibit, people come with all their stories because they see what's available to be done with their stories and they're interested further, which is great. And we're hoping to add more stories and switch different stories out depending on what people come and tell us.
And I really love that about the exhibit. It's imagined as a living exhibit, which keeps building, which is, again, not something that you would have in, say, something that's published or written, right? You can't change it once it's out there.
Yeah, and some of these interviews, so for example, this Burnaby resident, Sam Nyla, we interviewed him and his interview is available on heritageburnaby.ca. So there is a building of knowledge that'll continue to have different ramifications for the museum. We can add these stories into all the other exhibits when we have the opportunity, which is how we create a whole 10-acre site that represents this community.
This section continues the story of the local and the global connecting, because here on the left, what you see is the activism that South Asian Canadians were involved in through publications. And so you have publications by individuals who, and here is Kapoor Singh, who were connected to anti-colonial networks like the Ghaddar Party, who we mentioned, but were using different forms of mediums. In this case, the newspapers that they were using both talked about the problems that they encountered as migrants, as diaspora, but simultaneously talked about the issues that they felt were global, or then when they were reading the news about India, that continued to matter to them. Here you see a play that was produced by a group of individuals who drew on this history, but were very much local.
And one thing we wanted to do throughout the entire exhibit is present multiple languages. So there's different publications throughout, including here, that are featured in Punjabi or Urdu and English. So we also have a play from Vancouver South, which was a different collective theater group that operated in the 1980s in Burnaby. And it's in Punjabi, and we translated it into English for English language speakers to provide a different accessibility. So we weren't able to put multiple languages on the walls, so the exhibit itself is mostly in English, but the access points, the documents that are available, are in the multiple languages so that people can get something out of it. Everybody has the opportunity to. There's lots of different languages in what is defined as South Asia, so it was a choice that we had to make in terms of linguistic choices.
And it was a choice based on accessibility, because the different scripts, for example, this is one of the scripts that Punjabi is written in and would be accessible to a large proportion of the population, but people who were from the Pakistani Punjab and not the Indian Punjab would not be able to understand it. So what we wanted was that people, whether you're from North India or South India, whichever part of South Asia you're from, you're both represented in the script, but simultaneously are able to access all parts of the exhibit.
One story that became evident as an important one for our advisory committee was the exploration of food as a source of identity. So we chose to explore different scents that people identify as part of South Asian cuisine, which is incredibly diverse and very aromatic. And the different scents were chosen based on whether or not we heard from the community that these scents were important, or whether or not they were actually very difficult herbs or spices to find within Burnaby when they immigrated here. So we did choose to have the scent station be something that you actually smell. So this is something that you can actually learn a little bit more about turmeric, smell it, and then throughout the rest of the museum were other scents available that were part of South Asian cooking.
Yeah. And they're all extremely familiar to people, but the stories that were told to us is that before the 1960s, 1970s, they weren't accessible at all. They had to find alternatives. And you can read about that story in the brief excerpt up there.
So we chose to work with a South Asian artist, Jag Nagra, who's very active in the queer South Asian community, to represent some of the themes within the exhibit. So we wanted bright and bold and vibrant art, which is why Jag's art is perfect, as you can see, bright and bold and beautiful. And she did many different pieces for the exhibit. So she did the 3 front windows, as well as this large map of Burnaby representing different places of faith within Burnaby, which really expresses the diversity of experiences for South Asian Canadians in Burnaby.
And I think one of the things we both really wanted was to represent the fact that even though South Asians aren't there in the archive, the assumption is that they weren't there, but all of this exhibit has shown they actually were. And that's kind of what we asked Jag to do in the pieces that she made. So in this Burnaby map, these places of worship show that it was always a physical presence. In the other pieces that you can see, there are women who are stitching together the rajai that you see, or the razai as well, that you see in the middle part of the exhibit, because we couldn't actually get an image or detail about how that was put together. But we wanted to show that women were involved in the process. Similarly, the story of resistance, and the sort of much more metaphorical painting, where she's made a peacock who's looking somewhat sad as she watches the things that mean something to her having been transported across in suitcases, which is something that you see throughout the exhibit as well.
And we chose to have the front of the exhibit adorned with these lovely, bright and beautiful arches that represent different faith, places of faith. So we have a Sikh Gurdwara arch, as well as a Hindu temple arch and a mosque arch. So these are meant to represent various experiences of faith. So if you identify as one of those faiths, you would recognize that, want to go into the exhibit. But if you don't, you're curious. What does this mean? What is the exhibit inside? So that was our attempt to express diversity within these stories, as well as pique curiosity. And that was something that the advisory committee helped us navigate in terms of the politics of religion and and different choices to be made. Thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed your tour of Truths Not Often Told, being South Asian in Burnaby. We hope you come and look at it. It's available until the beginning of 2025 at the museum. Look at the website for hours and times. Thank you.
Thank you. Please do share your stories. This exhibit is very meaningful to a lot of people here, and especially to younger people. So thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I hope that you do enjoy it as much as we enjoyed putting it together.